The stagecoach rumbled to a halt, sending dust clouds billowing through the air as it pulled into the small town of Montezuma, Colorado in the spring of 1873. Katherine Evans clutched her small carpetbag with trembling hands, her heart pounding against her ribs. The purple-yellow bruise that marred her right cheekbone throbbed painfully as she stepped down from the coach, her eyes scanning the crowd nervously for the man who was to be her husband, a man she had never met, only corresponded with through letters for the past 6 months. The town of Montezuma was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a dusty main street with the majestic Rocky Mountains looming in the background. Mining had brought prosperity to parts of the region, though Montezuma itself remained modest. Katherine pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders despite the warm May air, an unconscious gesture of protection rather than for warmth. "Miss Evans?" A deep voice called from her left. Katherine turned, instinctively ducking her head to hide the bruise, though she knew it was pointless. The man approaching her was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of long days under the sun. He wore simple clothing, a blue cotton shirt, denim pants, boots covered in dust, and a wide-brimmed hat that he removed as he approached her. His eyes, a clear, steady blue, widened slightly as they landed on her injured face. "Mr. Flanagan," she asked softly. "Francis Zanetti," he corrected, his voice gentler now. "Everyone calls me Frank." "I'm sorry," Katherine stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I must have mistaken the name in your letters." Frank shook his head. "No mistake. Flanagan was my mother's name. I sometimes use it for correspondence." His eyes never left her face, but not in the way she was accustomed to being looked at with disgust or pity. There was something else there, something that made her heart skip a beat. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the scent of leather and horses that clung to him. Carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal, he reached out and with the gentlest touch, tilted her chin up so he could see her face properly. His jaw tightened at the sight of the bruise. "No one will ever hurt you again," he whispered, the promise fierce and certain in his blue eyes. Katherine felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had cried enough on the journey from Boston. This was to be a new beginning, and she would not start it with tears. "Your things?" Frank asked, his gaze reluctantly leaving her face to search for luggage. "Just this," she replied, lifting her small carpetbag slightly. "And a trunk that should be with the coach baggage." Frank nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. He knew what it meant when a woman traveled with so little that she had left in a hurry, that she was running from something or someone. "Wait here," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I'll get your trunk and then we'll head home." Home, the word sounded foreign to Katherine's ears. It had been a long time since she had had a real home. While Frank walked toward the rear of the stagecoach, Katherine took the opportunity to study him more carefully. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. His shoulders were broad, his frame lean but strong. He was perhaps 30, a few years older than her 23 years, with streaks of sunlight in his brown hair and the hint of smile lines around his eyes. He wasn't what she had expected. In his letters, he had described himself as a rancher with a modest spread outside of town. He had written about his life, his daily work, his hopes for a companion who might share his life and help build something lasting. There had been a gentleness to his words that had given her courage, but seeing him in person, the strength in his arms as he hefted her trunk easily, the quiet authority in his stance made her wonder if she had made the right decision. Frank returned with her trunk balanced on one shoulder, carrying it as if it weighed nothing. "My wagon's this way," he said, nodding toward the end of the street. Katherine followed him, acutely aware of the stares from townspeople going about their business. She kept her head down, used to avoiding eye contact after the past few years. The wagon was simple but well-maintained, with a team of 2 sturdy horses waiting patiently in their harnesses. Frank loaded her trunk into the back and then turned to help her up onto the seat. His hands were calloused but gentle as they encircled her waist, lifting her as if she were made of porcelain. "Thank you," she murmured, settling herself on the wooden seat and smoothing down her travel-worn dress. Frank climbed up beside her, taking the reins in his capable hands. "We've got about an hour's ride ahead of us," he explained. "My ranch is north of town, nestled in a little valley." As they pulled away from Montezuma, Katherine felt the curious eyes of the townspeople following them. She wondered what they thought of her, this bruised Eastern woman who had come to marry their neighbor. What kind of gossip would circulate tonight in the saloon and general store? "They'll talk," Frank said quietly, as if reading her mind. "Folk here don't have much else to do sometimes. But they're good people mostly. They'll come around once they know you. And if they don't," Katherine couldn't help asking. Frank glanced at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Then that's their loss, not ours." The simplicity of his answer eased something inside her. She had spent too long worrying about what others thought, trying to maintain appearances even as her world collapsed around her. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up before them, rolling hills dotted with pine trees, meadows lush with spring grasses, and always those magnificent mountains standing guard in the distance. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that made Katherine's breath catch in her throat. "It's not like Boston," Frank said, misinterpreting her silence. "No," Katherine agreed, then added hastily, "but it's beautiful, more beautiful than I imagined." Frank nodded, pleased by her response. "It can be harsh too. Winters are long and hard, summers can be dry. There's always work to be done." "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Zanetti." "Frank," he corrected gently. "If we're to be married, you should use my given name." Married. The word hung between them, a reminder of the arrangement that had brought her across the country to this wild place. "About that," Katherine began hesitantly. I understand if you wish to delay the wedding, given my condition." She gestured vaguely toward her bruised face, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Frank reined the horses to a stop, turning on the seat to face her fully. His blue eyes were intense as they studied her face. "Katherine," he said, her name sounding different in his deep voice, "I wrote to you asking for a wife because I need a partner in this life I'm building. Someone strong enough to face the challenges and someone kind enough to make it worth facing them. Nothing I see before me changes my mind about that." He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to his hands on the reins before meeting her eyes again. "But I won't hold you to anything you don't want. If you need time, we'll take time. If you decide this isn't what you want after all, I'll help you get wherever you want to go. You're not trapped here." Katherine's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Freedom of choice was something she had almost forgotten existed. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking back tears. Frank nodded once, then turned his attention back to the horses, clicking his tongue to set them in motion again. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves creating a soothing rhythm. "May I ask," Frank said eventually, his voice careful, "what happened? Who did that to you?" Katherine tensed, her fingers twisting in her lap. She had known the question would come, had prepared an answer, but now found herself wanting to tell the truth. "This man deserved at least that much, my former employer," she said quietly. "I worked as a governess for a wealthy family in Boston, the master of the house. He had expectations that went beyond my duties as a teacher to his children." Frank's hands tightened on the reins, but his voice remained calm. "And when you refused him, he wasn't accustomed to being refused anything," Katherine replied simply. "This," she touched her bruised cheek lightly, "was his parting gift when I gave my notice. I had already been corresponding with you by then. It seemed providential or desperate," she thought, but didn't say. "Did you report him to the authorities?" Frank asked. Katherine gave a bitter laugh. "Richard Harrington is one of Boston's most respected businessmen. His family has connections to the governor. Who would believe the word of a governess against his?" Frank nodded, understanding without her having to explain further. The world worked the same way everywhere power protected power. "Well, you're far from Boston now," he said firmly. "And like I said, no one will hurt you here, I promise you that." They crested a small hill, and suddenly Frank's ranch came into view. It was modest compared to some of the sprawling cattle operations Katherine had read about, but impressive nonetheless. A sturdy two-story house built of hewn logs stood in a clearing, with a large barn and several outbuildings nearby. Fenced pastures stretched out on either side, and Katherine could see cattle grazing in the distance. A small creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwood trees just coming into leaf. "It's not much yet," Frank said, a hint of apology in his voice, "but I've been adding to it each year." "The house is solid, though. Built it myself with some help from neighbors." "It's wonderful," Katherine said sincerely, already imagining curtains at the windows and perhaps flowers planted along the front path. Frank looked pleased at her response. As they drew closer, a dog came bounding out to meet them, a large black and white border collie that ran circles around the wagon, barking joyfully. "That's Patch," Frank explained with a smile. "Best cattle dog in Colorado territory, though he thinks he's the master of the house." The wagon pulled up in front of the house, and Frank set the brake before jumping down. He came around to Catherine's side and reached up to help her down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment they stood close together, his hands lingering perhaps a second longer than necessary. "Welcome to your new home, Katherine," he said softly, a flutter of something fear, anticipation. Hope stirred in Catherine's chest as she took in her surroundings. This was to be her life now, with this quiet, strong man and his ranch in the Colorado wilderness. "Thank you for bringing me here," she replied, meaning it more than she could express. Frank smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face and made her breath catch. "Let's get you settled in. You must be tired after your journey." As they walked toward the house, Patch dancing around their feet, Katherine felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't naive enough to believe that all her troubles were behind her. Life was never that simple, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something that might have been hope. The inside of the house was surprisingly comfortable. The main floor consisted of a large kitchen with a massive stone fireplace, a dining area, and a sitting room with simple but sturdy furniture. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that made Catherine's heart lift. Her new husband was a reader. "The bedroom's upstairs," Frank said, carrying her trunk in from the wagon. "There are two up there, I thought. That is, I've prepared the larger one for you. I'll take the smaller until you decide otherwise." A blush colored his tanned cheeks, and Katherine felt her own face warm in response. It was a thoughtful gesture, one that spoke volumes about the kind of man he was. "That's very considerate of you," she said softly. Frank nodded, seemingly relieved by her response. "The washroom's through there," he said, pointing to a door off the kitchen. "I've rigged up a pump inside so you don't have to go out to the well. It's cold water only, but I heat water on the stove for bathing." Katherine was impressed. Indoor plumbing of any kind was a luxury in this part of the country. "You must be hungry," Frank continued. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can fry up some bacon and eggs if you'd like." "Please let me," Katherine insisted, removing her shawl and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Cooking is something I can do to earn my keep right away." Frank looked like he might protest, but then nodded. "All right, I'll show you where everything is, then go see to the horses while you cook." As Katherine explored the kitchen, she was pleasantly surprised by how well stocked and organized it was. The pantry held flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples, while a small cold storage area contained eggs, bacon, and a crock of butter. Frank clearly lived simply but comfortably. She set about preparing a meal, finding comfort in the familiar motions of cooking. By the time Frank returned from the barn, she had bacon frying in a pan and biscuits in the oven. "Smells like heaven," he said, washing his hands at the pump sink. "It's been a long while since anyone cooked in this kitchen but me." They ate at the table by the window, the late afternoon sun streaming in and warming the room. Katherine found herself relaxing as they talked, Frank telling her about the ranch and the surrounding area, careful to keep the conversation light and undemanding. After the meal, as Katherine washed the dishes, refusing Frank's offer to help, she looked out the window to see the sun beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "The sunsets here are like nothing else," Frank said, coming to stand beside her at the window, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "It's beautiful," she agreed, drying her hands on a towel. "Katherine," Frank said softly, turning to face her. "I want you to know that I meant what I said earlier. You're safe here, and you're free to make your own choices. Our arrangement. I know it's not conventional, but I hope in time we might build something good together." His sincerity touched something deep inside her, a part of her heart that had been walled off for protection. "I hope so too," she whispered. That night, as Katherine lay in the comfortable bed in her new room, a room with a window that looked out over the mountains, and a small vase of wildflowers on the dresser that Frank must have picked for her arrival, she felt the tension of the past months begin to uncoil from her body. Sleep came easier than it had in a long time. The next morning, Katherine woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement downstairs. She dressed quickly in one of her few dresses, painfully aware of how unsuitable her Boston clothing was for ranch life. The bruise on her face had faded slightly overnight, turning a mottled green-yellow at the edges. Downstairs, she found Frank already dressed for the day's work, stirring something on the stove. "Good morning," he said, smiling when he saw her. "I was trying not to wake you. Thought you might need the rest after your journey." "I'm used to early rising," Katherine assured him, "and I want to learn the routine here so I can be useful." Frank gestured to the pot on the stove. "Oatmeal, not fancy, but it fills you up for the morning work." They ate together, Frank explaining his plans for the day, checking on a pregnant heifer, repairing a section of fence, and riding out to check on the cattle in the north pasture. "I'd like to come with you," Katherine said impulsively. "That is, if you don't mind." "I want to see the ranch, and I'm a good rider." Frank looked surprised but pleased. "I'd welcome the company, but are you sure? It's a good few hours in the saddle." "I'm sure," Katherine said firmly. "I can't learn about my new home by staying inside the house." An hour later, they rode out together. Katherine on a gentle mare named Daisy that Frank assured her was the sweetest-tempered horse on the ranch. Katherine had changed into her simplest dress and borrowed a wide-brimmed hat from Frank to protect her fair skin from the sun. The day was clear and bright, the spring air filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. As they rode, Frank pointed out landmarks and boundaries, explaining how he had built up the ranch over the past 5 years since coming west from Pennsylvania. "What brought you here?" Katherine asked as they paused on a ridge overlooking a valley where a small herd of Frank's cattle grazed. Frank was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "The war," he finally said. "After Gettysburg, I couldn't go back to the life I had before, too many ghosts." Katherine nodded, understanding. The Civil War had ended 8 years ago, but its shadows still stretched long over the country. "My brother died at Antietam," she offered quietly. "He was only 19. Frank looked at her, a shared grief passing between them without words. "I'm sorry," he said simply. They rode on, the conversation turning to lighter topics, the names of wildflowers blooming in the meadows, the antics of a young calf that kept escaping its mother, the hawk soaring overhead. By the time they returned to the ranch house in the late afternoon, Katherine's muscles ached from the unaccustomed exercise, but she felt more alive than she had in months. Being outdoors, seeing the beauty of the land that was now her home, had rekindled something inside her that she thought had been extinguished forever. Over the next few days, a routine began to establish itself. Katherine rose early with Frank prepared breakfast, and then set about learning the workings of the ranch house while he tended to the outdoor chores. She took inventory of supplies, cleaned years of bachelor dust from corners, and began to add small touches to make the house more homey, arranging wildflowers in jars, repositioning furniture for better conversation, hanging up the few decorative items she had brought with her. In the afternoons, she often joined Frank outside, learning about the animals and the land. He was a patient teacher, never condescending, always willing to explain and demonstrate. Katherine discovered she had an affinity for the chickens Frank kept in a coop near the house, and soon took over their care completely. They hadn't discussed the wedding again, both seeming content to let things develop naturally between them. They ate their meals together, talked in the evenings by the fire, and slowly began to learn each other's habits and preferences. Frank, Katherine discovered, had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed. He loved books, particularly history and adventure tales, and often read aloud in the evenings, his deep voice bringing the stories to life. Katherine found herself watching him when he wasn't looking the way his hands moved competently at whatever task he undertook, the crinkles that appeared at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the gentleness with which he treated every creature on the ranch, from the smallest chick to the largest bull. A week after her arrival, they made a trip into Montezuma for supplies. Katherine was nervous about facing the townspeople, but Frank stayed close by her side, his quiet presence reassuring. The bruise on her face had faded to a faint yellowish shadow, but she still felt self-conscious. The general store was run by a round, cheerful man named Henry Wilkins, who greeted Frank warmly and cast curious but not unkind glances at Katherine. "Henry, this is Miss Katherine Evans," Frank said, his hand coming to rest lightly on the small of Katherine's back. "My fiancée." The word sent an unexpected thrill through Katherine. It was the first time Frank had referred to her that way to someone else. "Miss Evans, welcome to Montezuma," Henry said, beaming. "We've been wondering when Frank here would finally bring you to meet us." "Thank you," Katherine replied, summoning a smile. "It's a pleasure to be here." As Frank discussed his supply needs with Henry, the door to the store opened, and a woman about Katherine's age entered, carrying a small child on her hip. "Sarah," Frank called, waving the woman over. "Come meet Katherine." Sarah Donovan, it turned out, was the wife of the local blacksmith and one of Frank's closest friends in town. She welcomed Katherine warmly, her green eyes kind as she took in Katherine's fading bruise without comment. "You must come to dinner," Sarah insisted, bouncing her son on her hip. "James would love to meet you, and it would do you good to have some company besides this gruff cowboy." She elbowed Frank playfully. "We'd be delighted," Frank answered for both of them, looking to Katherine for confirmation. Katherine nodded, finding she actually meant it. The prospect of friendship in this new place was appealing. As they left the store with their supplies loaded in the wagon, several more townspeople approached, each curious about the woman Frank Zanetti had brought home. Some were openly inquisitive, others more reserved, but all seemed genuinely welcoming. "They like you," Frank said as they drove out of town, a hint of pride in his voice. "They're kind," Katherine replied, though she suspected much of their warmth stemmed from the respect they clearly had for Frank. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a comfortable silence between them, Frank reached over and took Katherine's hand in his. It was the first time he had initiated such contact since helping her down from the stagecoach on that first day. His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand, the sensation sending shivers up Katherine's arm. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low, "that we might talk to Reverend Williams about the wedding when we go to town next week, if you're ready." Katherine looked at their joined hands, then up at Frank's face. The setting sun painted his features in golden light, highlighting the kindness in his eyes, the strength in his jaw. She had known him only a short time, but in that time he had shown her nothing but respect, consideration, and gentle care. "I'm ready," she said softly, surprised to find she meant it. Frank's smile was like the sunrise, slow to start, but then brilliant, transforming his entire face. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then it's settled," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll speak to Reverend Williams on Sunday." Sunday arrived clear and warm. Katherine wore her best dress, a blue cotton that Frank had complimented once, and tied her hair back with a ribbon. The bruise on her face had faded completely, leaving no trace of her past life visible to the outside world, though she knew the internal scars would take longer to heal. The small church in Montezuma was filled with familiar faces from their previous trips to town. Sarah Donovan waved from a pew near the front, her husband James nodding a greeting as Frank and Katherine slipped into a seat behind them. After the service, while the congregation lingered to socialize, Frank led Katherine to Reverend Williams, a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a scholarly air. "Miss Evans," the Reverend said, taking her hand in both of his. "Frank has told me so much about you. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "The pleasure is mine, Reverend," Katherine replied. "We were hoping," Frank said, his hand finding Katherine's, "that you might be available to marry us next Sunday. Nothing elaborate, just a simple ceremony after the regular service." Reverend Williams beamed. "I would be honored." We'll announce the bands today and everything will be in order for next week." He looked at Katherine. "Do you have family coming for the ceremony, my dear?" Katherine shook her head, a pang of sadness touching her heart. "No, Reverend. My parents passed several years ago and my only brother died in the war." The Reverend's face softened with sympathy. "Then we shall be your family," he said firmly. "This community takes care of its own and you are one of us now." His words brought unexpected tears to Katherine's eyes. She had not realized how much she longed to belong somewhere again until that moment. The week leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Word had spread quickly through the small community, and the women of Montezuma rallied around Katherine with offers of help. Sarah arrived at the ranch with a beautiful white lace collar to add to Katherine's blue dress, insisting it would serve as something borrowed. Mrs. Wilkins from the general store brought a cake, and several other women appeared with dishes and decorations for after the ceremony. Frank, watching these proceedings with bemusement, whispered to Katherine, "I think they've been waiting years to throw a wedding celebration. They're making the most of it." The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. Katherine woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement. Frank had already left the house when she came downstairs, leaving a note explaining he had gone to help James Donovan with a last-minute issue at the blacksmith shop and would meet her at the church. Sarah arrived mid-morning to help Katherine prepare, bringing her young son and a basket of wildflowers to fashion into a simple bouquet. As she helped pin the lace collar to Katherine's dress, Sarah asked quietly, "Are you happy, Katherine? With Frank, I mean." Katherine considered the question seriously. "I am," she answered truthfully. "He's a good man, kind and honest. I know we haven't known each other long, but time doesn't always matter," Sarah said wisely. "James and I knew after 2 weeks. Sometimes the heart just knows." Katherine smiled, thinking of Frank's steady presence, the way his eyes followed her around a room, the gentleness in his hands when he touched her. "Yes," she agreed. "Sometimes it does." The church was filled to capacity when Katherine arrived. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the occasion. She waited nervously at the back of the church, clutching her wildflower bouquet until the small pump organ began to play. And then she saw Frank, standing at the front beside Reverend Williams, looking so handsome in his best shirt and clean pants that her heart skipped a beat. His eyes found hers across the church, and the love shining in them gave her the courage to step forward. The ceremony was simple but moving. They exchanged traditional vows, Frank's voice steady and sure, Katherine's softer but equally certain. When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Frank's kiss was gentle and brief, mindful of their audience, but the promise in his eyes made Katherine blush. The celebration afterward was anything but subdued. Tables had been set up outside the church, laden with food contributed by every family in town. Music played, children ran about, and Katherine found herself passed from one well-wisher to another, everyone eager to welcome her properly to the community. Through it all, Frank stayed close, his hand often finding hers, his eyes checking regularly to make sure she wasn't overwhelmed. When he noticed her growing tired, he smoothly made their excuses and guided her toward their wagon. "Thank you," she whispered as they drove away, the sounds of celebration fading behind them. "For knowing when I needed to leave." Frank smiled, reaching over to take her hand. "We're partners now," he said simply. "That means paying attention to each other's needs, partners." The word settled comfortably in Katherine's heart. Yes, that felt right. When they arrived back at the ranch, their home, Frank surprised her by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold, making her laugh with delight. He set her down gently in the main room, which had been transformed in their absence. Fresh wildflowers filled vases on every surface, candles were lit, and a bottle of wine stood on the table with 2 glasses. "Sarah and James," Frank explained, seeing her surprise. "They insisted on giving us a proper wedding night." The mention of the wedding night brought a flush to Katherine's cheeks. Frank noticed and took a step back, giving her space. "Katherine," he said softly, "nothing happens tonight that you don't want. I meant what I said before you make the choices here." The tenderness in his voice, the respect in his eyes, made something shift inside Katherine. She moved toward him slowly, reaching up to touch his face. "I choose you, Frank Zanetti," she whispered. "I choose this life with you." Frank's arms came around her, drawing her close. This kiss was different from the one in the church, deeper, more intimate, filled with a promise of things to come. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. "I love you, Katherine," Frank said, the words simple but profound. "I think I've loved you since I first saw you step down from that stagecoach, even with my bruised face," she teased gently. "Especially then," he said seriously, "because I saw your courage, your strength. You traveled across the country alone to start a new life with a stranger." "That takes remarkable bravery." Katherine felt tears gather in her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered, the words new on her tongue but true in her heart. "Thank you for giving me a home, for making me feel safe again." Frank's smile was tender as he wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "That's what partners do," he said. "Now, shall we open that wine our friends so thoughtfully provided?" Later that night, as they lay together in what was now their shared bedroom, the moonlight casting silver patterns across the quilt, Katherine felt a sense of peace she had thought lost to her forever. Frank's arm was wrapped around her, holding her securely against the solid warmth of his chest, his breath steady in sleep. This was what home felt like, she realized. Not a place, but a feeling of belonging, of safety, of love. The days and weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of shared work and growing intimacy. Katherine learned the routines of ranch life quickly, finding satisfaction in the physical labor and simple pleasures. Frank proved to be a patient teacher and an attentive husband, always mindful of her comfort and happiness. They worked side by side during the days, Frank teaching Katherine to ride better, to help with the cattle, to manage the garden she had started near the house. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch watching the sunset, or read by the fire, or simply talk, learning each other's stories, dreams, and fears. Katherine told Frank more about her life in Boston, about the grief of losing her brother in the war, about her parents' deaths from influenza that left her alone and forced to seek employment as a governess. She told him about Richard Harrington and his unwanted advances, how his final attack had been the catalyst for her decision to answer Frank's advertisement for a mail-order bride. Frank, in turn, shared stories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his time in the Union Army, the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in the night. He told her about coming west after the war, working on other ranches until he saved enough to buy his own land, the loneliness that had prompted him to seek a wife through correspondence. "I never expected to find someone like you," he confessed one evening as they sat wrapped in a blanket on the porch, watching a summer storm roll in across the mountains. "Someone who fits so perfectly into my life, into my heart." Katherine leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. "I never expected to find happiness again," she replied softly. "You gave me that gift, Frank. Their life wasn't without challenges." Summer brought drought conditions that threatened the cattle and forced Frank to spend long days moving the herd to better grazing grounds. Fall arrived with an early frost that damaged part of Katherine's carefully tended garden. There were arguments, small disagreements about household management or ranch decisions that they learned to navigate together, but through it all, their bond strengthened. Frank never raised his voice in anger, never used his physical strength to intimidate. Katherine grew more confident, more willing to speak her mind, to stand her ground when she believed she was right. They learned the art of compromise, of partnership in its truest form. Their first Christmas together brought a special gift. Katherine, who had been feeling unwell for several weeks, finally consulted with Sarah Donovan, who confirmed what Katherine had begun to suspect: a baby would arrive in the summer. When she told Frank that evening, his face transformed with joy. He lifted her off her feet and spun her in a circle, then set her down quickly, apologizing for his exuberance. "Are you happy?" he asked, suddenly serious, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Katherine assured him, covering his hands with her own. That night, as snow fell softly outside their window, they lay together planning for this new life they had created, discussing names. imagining tiny fingers and toes, wondering whether their child would have Frank's blue eyes or Catherine's auburn hair. The winter passed slowly, each day marked by the subtle changes in Catherine's body as their child grew within her. Frank became even more protective, insisting on doing the heavier chores, bringing Catherine little treats from town, reading to both her and the baby in the evenings. Spring brought new life to the ranch calves in the fields, chicks in the coop, and flowers blooming in Catherine's expanded garden. Her belly grew rounder, and the baby's movements became stronger, little kicks and rolls that made both parents laugh with delight when they felt them. The women of Montezuma rallied around Catherine again, bringing baby clothes, offering advice, planning a celebration for after the birth. Catherine, who had once been so alone in the world, now found herself surrounded by a community that cared for her well-being. Summer arrived hot and dry. Catherine, in her final month of pregnancy, moved slowly in the heat, spending much of her time inside the relatively cool house or in the shade of the porch. Frank hovered anxiously, dividing his time between necessary ranch work and checking on his wife. It was on a scorching July afternoon that Catherine's labor began. Frank rode at breakneck speed to town to fetch Sarah, who had helped deliver most of the babies in the area, and the doctor if he was available. He returned with both, just as Catherine's pains were intensifying. The next 12 hours were a blur of pain and effort for Catherine, and helpless anxiety for Frank, who was banished to the porch by Sarah's firm instructions. Just as dawn was breaking over the mountains, casting long golden rays through the bedroom window, their son was born a healthy, robust boy with a shock of dark hair, and when he finally opened them, his father's blue eyes. "Daniel," Catherine whispered when Frank was finally allowed into the room, cradling their son against her chest. "After my brother, if that's all right with you." Frank, tears streaming unashamedly down his face, could only nod as he perched carefully on the edge of the bed, one large finger gently stroking his son's tiny cheek. "Daniel Zanetti," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Welcome to the world, son." The years that followed brought changes to the Zanetti ranch. With the profits from several good seasons, Frank built an addition to the house, 2 more bedrooms, and a proper indoor bathroom with a pump that delivered hot water as well as cold, a luxury that Catherine appreciated beyond measure. Daniel grew from a cheerful baby into a sturdy toddler with his father's adventurous spirit and his mother's quick mind. He followed Frank everywhere, perched on a horse before he could walk properly, helping with chores as soon as he was able. 2 years after Daniel's birth, Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Frank's mother. She was a quieter child than her brother, observant and thoughtful, with Catherine's auburn hair and a smile that could wrap her father around her tiny finger. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Catherine proved to have a good head for business, keeping meticulous records and suggesting innovations that increased their profits. Frank's knowledge of cattle and land management, combined with his willingness to adopt new techniques, made their operation one of the most successful in the area. They became known in the community for their hospitality, hosting gatherings for holidays and barn raisings, offering help to neighbors in need, contributing to the small school that had been established in Montezuma as the town grew. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching Daniel and Elizabeth playing with Patch's puppies in the yard, Frank turned to Catherine with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming here, marrying a stranger, taking on this hard life." Catherine looked at her husband, his face more lined now than when they'd met, his hair showing touches of gray at the temples, but his eyes still that same clear, honest blue that had first given her hope all those years ago. "Never," she said firmly, taking his hand in hers. "Not for a single moment." Frank smiled, raising her hand to his lips in a gesture that had become familiar over their years together but still made her heart flutter. "Me neither," he said. "Best decision I ever made was sending that letter east." Catherine leaned against his shoulder, watching their children laugh in the golden afternoon light. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day when you saw my bruised face?" Frank nodded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. I promised no one would ever hurt you again." "And you kept that promise," Catherine said softly, "not just by protecting me from harm, but by giving me a home, a family, a purpose." She turned to face him, touching his cheek gently. "You healed something in me that I thought was broken beyond repair." Frank caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "And you gave me back a part of myself I thought died in the war," he replied. "You brought light back into my life, Catherine." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of gold and crimson, they called the children in for supper. Daniel, now 8, raced ahead, always eager for his mother's cooking. Elizabeth, 6 and more deliberate, paused to pick a wildflower to add to the perpetual bouquet on the kitchen table. Inside, lamps glowed warmly against the gathering dusk. The house smelled of fresh bread and stew simmering on the stove. Voices and laughter filled the rooms that had once stood silent and empty. This was the life they had built together, day by day, choice by choice. A life born from a desperate decision and a whispered promise, transformed by love into something neither of them could have imagined that spring day when a stagecoach rolled into Montezuma, carrying a bruised young woman with little more than hope in her carpetbag. As Catherine moved around the kitchen, serving her family, catching Frank's eye across the table and sharing a private smile, she felt a deep contentment settle in her heart. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, as they had faced everything for the past decade with courage, with respect, and with a love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. Outside, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over them from the beginning of their journey together. Inside, in the warmth of their home, the Zanetti family gathered close, bound by ties stronger than blood ties of choice, of promise kept, of love freely given and joyfully received. And in that moment, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that this family, this home, this life was exactly where she was meant to be.